the project onto a head stick, we're going to try weaving. Finger weaving doesn't really take that many supplies, but you will need a few things. First off, you'll need your yarn. You will need a pair of scissors, a tape measure or a yardstick, a dowel rod or pencil, something to secure your yarn to, and then you'll need just something that you can attach that dowel rod to hold your yarn as you weave. Optionally, to hold your finger weaving, you can just use a pillow and a large safety pin to pin your yarn. Some painter's tape or masking tape, any of these things will work. I've loaded my project onto the head stick. I'm doing a full-size sash, so I'm loaded it in the center. I have half of my yarn on one side of my head stick and half on the other. For a diagonal, you don't technically have to do that. You can weave from one end to the other, but it's a lot easier to work with just this much yarn versus all of the yarn. So I usually go ahead and start in the center just because that gives me more, or I have to have less yarn at the end to kind of work with. So we're gonna start weaving. We're going to start on the far left. And so to start weaving, what we're going to do is you're going to hold your stack with your right hand with the index finger running right through the shed, and with your other three fingers behind the shed, behind the stack, and your thumb on top of the stack. Okay, so we're actually going to be doing two movements. We're going to be moving the bottom threads of the stack of your warp threads to the top. We're going to move the top threads to the bottom. We're also going to be transferring the stack from our right hand to our left as we weave. So all of the warp threads that have not been woven for that row are going to be on your right hand, and all the warp threads that you have wove for that row will be moved over to your left hand. Okay, so you've got kind of two different things going on at the same time. So what we're going to do is, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take the first strand, in this case it comes off the top of the head stick on top of my finger. So we're going to take that first one and we're going to wrap it kind of around and behind the next strand, which is a bottom thread, bottom row strand. Okay, so the top one's going to go behind it, and we're going to move that previous bottom that's now on top, we're going to move it to our left hand. Then we're going to go over the next strand because it comes up from on top of my finger. So it's going to go behind my hand and behind the strand. So then the next one is a lower strand, so it's going to come up and over my weft thread to my left hand. The next one's a top thread, so it's going to go behind my finger and the weft strand. The next bottom one is going to come from the top or from the bottom and go over the weft strand. The next one's a top thread, so it's going to go behind my weft. And then again from below is going to go over my weft. The next top one's going to go behind my weft. The next bottom one's going to come above my weft. And we're just going to alternate that way all the way across. Okay, so my fingers, I don't know if you can see it, so I'm going to exaggerate, do a slight turning motion as I move it over to help me grab the other strands. So kind of like when I've got, the next one is a bottom one that needs to come up, so I'm going to kind of move my fingers forward, pointing toward me a little more so that I can grab that weft bottom warp to bring it above the weft. And then the next one, since it's on top, I'm going to kind of point it away from me and point my fingers away from me so that I can grab from behind the weft to get the next warp thread. And so you're going to get kind of a rocking motion. I'm really kind of exaggerating it here. You don't have to do it that much, but that kind of gives you the idea of what movement my hands are doing. So as I do it, that just kind of helps me grab the yarn and still keep the weft traveling along the shed along with my left index finger as it goes over. So the top one goes behind, the bottom one's going to come above. The top one's going to go behind, the bottom one's going to go above. And so it really doesn't matter. So I've finished all those orange. I'm going to do a brown one next. The color of the yarn does not affect my weaving order or what I do. I just want to make sure that it's actually the next one in line. So that's what that head stick can really help you with. That first row helps you see which is the next thread. It's because you always want to alternate a top, grab a top one and then grab a bottom one, then get a top one and get a bottom one. And so you're alternating all the way across the stack. And sometimes I might kind of have to smooth these out with my hands to make sure that as they come off that head stick that I'm getting them in the right order. The easiest to see is right up here at the top. You can kind of watch that. If you pull it apart a little bit, it kind of shows you what the next strand is going to be if you need to do that. The first couple of rows are probably going to be the hardest because your yarn is not really set, and it might try and, a lot of times it'll try and twist out of place and get out of order. And so after you've wove about 4 or 5 rows, then that yarn is kind of trained. It gets in the track and it kind of knows what its neighbor is and it stays in place better. And so it's a lot easier. You don't have to kind of check as often to make sure that you're actually getting the next one, because they'll be held in place by the previous rows. And so that kind of helps keep them in place after you've got several rows in. So don't get upset, don't get frustrated those first few rows. You know, just kind of keep smoothing your yarn out and making sure you've got the next yarn that you're supposed to get, the next strand. Those first couple rows are kind of, you have to kind of watch them a little closer. But as you practice and you do them, you'll get used to being able, knowing what what to look for, how to see it faster, and know whether you're strand. Okay, so I've got all the way across the row. And so when I do, I'm gonna let this one, I'm gonna kind of wrap it around my head stick over here, and it's gonna kind of sit out. The reason it's gonna sit out is because we want it to drop back in, because we only want one out at a time. But right now, if you open up your bottom strands from your top strands, you'll see this shed here, this warp is just laying loose. It doesn't have anything to hold it in place where it needs to stay. And so if you've got it wrapped where it kind of holds out, then this kind of keeps it up in the place where it belongs until you can get the next row woven. Because when we go back over here, so once we finish that row, we're going to start back over on the same side, back on the left. And you're again going to grab the top one. It should also be a top one again, just like last time. You should always start with the top one and you just wrap it around to behind the bottom one. And you're just going to do the same thing as you did the first time. Over or under the top threads, under the bottom threads, over the top threads, because you want to bring your bottom threads to the top for the next row. And then over that top one and under that bottom one, over the top one, under the bottom one. Again, you're just going to do that all the way across, alternating over the top one, under the bottom one, all the way across. But as you can see, the strands I've already wove. If I open up this shed again, you can see that. I'm going to take the new warp out because we're looking at the old warp from the last row. You can see that you don't see it here, that by alternating those strands, it's holding up and covering up the previous warp. But over here, I haven't wove yet, so it's still hanging out. So you know you're doing it right. If here, you're not going to see that old one, but what you are going to see is this new one that we're working and pulling over, and it's going to sit right in the new shed that you're creating. So I drop back in. The last one was a bottom thread that went over my warp, over my weft. So I'm going to take that weft over the next top one and under the next bottom one. Over the next top one, under the next bottom one. And again, we're just going to alternate over and under those strands all the way across. Okay. And as you can go across, you can always tell if you're getting the right strand, because if you pull it apart like this, the next one is, you'll see that strand above the previous warp. You'll see which one is the strand that you're supposed to be getting. So if they kind of seem like they're twisting out of line, or they're not, you know, laying flat like this is trying to twist a little bit, I can pull and see which strand is actually the next one that I need to work with. And so as we go across, remember, just alternating over, under, over, under. As we get close to the end of the second row, when I finish, this new warp is going to be the one hanging out, and we're going to bring the other warp, previous warp, back into our stack. Last strand here goes underneath. We're going to pull this new warp thread out. Then we're going to take the last row's warp thread and we're going to drop it back into the stack on top, because the last strand went underneath, and then we're just going to hang out the new warp thread is going to hang out over there, and it now becomes the old warp thread as we start a third row. And again, we just go back to the far left, we pick up the first one, which comes from the top, wrap it around behind the bottom one, and then weave alternately like we've done the last two rows, just over a top strand and under a bottom strand, over a top strand, under a bottom strand.